Hey everyone, tonight we're exploring the most catastrophic transformation in cosmic history. The story of how the most beautiful, most powerful, most perfect being ever created became the very embodiment of evil itself. We're diving into the fall of Lucifer, whose name meant light bearer, and who once stood closer to the throne of God than any other creature in existence. This is the story of how pride can corrupt even perfection, how a single thought can shatter eternity, and how the angel who led heaven's worship became the architect of heaven's first war. It's the ultimate cautionary tale about the seductive power of ambition and the devastating cost of placing ourselves at the centre of our own universe. So without further ado, let's begin. Before time carved its first mark upon creation, before the first star ignited in the vast expanse of nothingness, there existed a realm where light itself was born. In the courts of the Almighty, where the very air shimmered with glory and the ground beneath bore the weight of infinite majesty, there walked one whose beauty surpassed even the morning star. His name was Lucifer, light-bearer, son of the dawn, and in all the hierarchies of heaven none stood closer to the throne than he. The celestial city stretched beyond mortal comprehension, its crystalline spires reaching into dimensions that had no names. Here, in chambers carved from living light, the cherubim and seraphim gathered in eternal worship, their voices creating harmonies that would have shattered lesser realms. Yet even among these magnificent beings, Lucifer commanded attention. When he spread his 6 wings, they caught and refracted the divine radiance like prisms of impossible beauty. His voice, when raised in worship, seemed to give melody meaning itself. In those timeless days before the rebellion, Lucifer served as the covering cherub, the guardian of the Most High's very presence. No decree went forth without his knowledge, no council was held without his voice among the assembly. He was wisdom personified, beauty incarnate, and power without equal among the created beings. The other angels looked to him not merely with respect, but with something approaching awe. Even Michael the archangel, commander of heaven's hosts, acknowledged the unique position that the light-bearer held. But perfection, it would seem, carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The first stirring of what would become the great catastrophe began not with dramatic rebellion, but with a thought, a single, gleaming consideration that took root in a mind that had never known corruption. As Lucifer gazed upon the throne of the Almighty during one of the great assemblies, where 10,000 times 10,000 angels bowed in worship, something shifted within him. The praise that flowed from his lips continued unabated, but behind his eyes, a question began to form. Why should glory belong to one alone when such beauty and power dwelt within the created order? Why should worship flow in only one direction when beings of such magnificence surrounded the throne? The thoughts came softly at first, like whispers of silk against his consciousness. They seemed almost reasonable, these musings about the nature of authority and the distribution of divine prerogatives. In the great library of heaven, where the scrolls of destiny lay open and the chronicles of eternity were inscribed in letters of fire, Lucifer found himself spending longer hours in contemplation. Other angels would discover him there, his luminous form bent over ancient texts, his fingers tracing passages that spoke of dominion and kingship. When questioned about his studies, he would smile, that devastating smile that had charmed the courts of glory for eons, and speak of deeper understanding, of plumbing the mysteries of divine order. Surely, he would say to those who gathered around him, we who serve so faithfully deserve to understand the fullness of what we serve. Gabriel, the messenger archangel, was among the first to notice the subtle change in his companion. Where once Lucifer's conversations had centered on the wonder of the divine presence, now they turned increasingly toward philosophical inquiries about the nature of authority itself. The light-bearer began to pose questions that seemed innocent enough on their surface, but carried undertones that made the golden messenger uncomfortable. "Tell me, Gabriel," Lucifer said one day as they walked together through the gardens of paradise, where trees of light bore fruit that sustained the angelic host. "Have you never wondered why worship flows in only one direction? We are made in his image, are we not? Do we not bear within ourselves something of the divine nature?" Gabriel paused beside a fountain whose waters sparkled with captured starlight. "We are created beings, brother. Beautiful, yes. Powerful, certainly, but created nonetheless." But consider, Lucifer pressed, his voice taking on that hypnotic quality that had always made others eager to listen, the magnitude of what we are. Look around you, at the splendour of this realm, at the majesty of our forms, at the power that flows through our very being. Are we so different from the one we serve? Yes, Gabriel replied quietly, but already he could see that his words fell on ears that had grown selective in their hearing. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Lucifer continued to fulfill his duties as covering cherub, continued to lead worship, continued to counsel with the divine throne. But those who knew him best began to detect subtle changes. His worship, while still magnificent, seemed somehow calculated, performed rather than felt. His counsel, while still wise, carried undertones of ambition that had never been present before. In the great council chambers, where the affairs of creation were planned and the fate of the worlds was determined, Lucifer's voice began to carry new weight. No longer content to simply agree with divine decree, he began to offer alternatives, suggestions for how things might be done differently. His proposals were always reasonable, always cloaked in language of service and devotion, but underneath lay something else, a growing conviction that he could improve upon the existing order. Raphael, the healing angel, found himself increasingly troubled by conversations with the light-bearer. "There is something changed in him," he confided to Michael during one of their walks along the crystal sea that bordered the throne room. His words remained beautiful, his form magnificent as ever, but behind his eyes, there is something hungry there. Michael, whose very name meant "who is like God," a question that served as both declaration and challenge, had been watching Lucifer with growing concern. The archangel had noticed how the covering cherub's posture had changed during worship, how he seemed to hold himself differently, as if measuring himself against the one he served rather than simply serving. More troubling still were the conversations Michael had begun to overhear among some of the lesser angels, whispered discussions about worthiness, about the distribution of divine favour, about whether the created order truly reflected perfect justice. "He is gathering influence," Michael observed, his voice heavy with the weight of implications. "Subtle, yes, but unmistakable to those who know what to look for." "But surely he would not," Raphael began, then stopped, unable to voice the unthinkable. "Pride," Michael said simply, "the deadliest poison that could enter a perfect mind, and I fear it has already begun its work." As eons passed, or what would have been eons in realms where time held meaning, Lucifer's influence spread like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Angels who had never questioned the divine order began to ask why their service was not rewarded with greater authority. Seraphim wondered why their burning devotion did not elevate them to positions of greater prominence. Even some of the cherubim began to murmur about the limitations placed upon their magnificent natures. The light-bearer moved among them all, never openly advocating rebellion, never directly challenging the throne, but always asking questions, always suggesting that perhaps they deserved more than they had been given. His beauty remained undimmed, his wisdom unquestioned, and his position as covering cherub unassailable. Who could argue with one who stood so close to the divine presence? Who could question the loyalty of heaven's most magnificent servant? But in the hidden chambers of his heart, Lucifer nursed thoughts that grew darker with each passing moment. The throne room, which had once been the source of his greatest joy, now filled him with a mixture of longing and resentment. The worship he led began to feel like mockery. Why should such magnificent beings prostrate themselves before another, even if that other was their creator? One day, as the great assembly gathered for worship and the voices of millions of angels rose in harmonious praise, Lucifer found himself unable to sing. The words that had flowed so naturally for eons stuck in his throat like ashes. He stood in his place of honour, his magnificent form still radiating light, but his voice remained silent. Around him the worship continued, but within him something fundamental had broken. That night, if night had meaning in a realm of eternal light, Lucifer stood alone on the highest pinnacle of the celestial city, gazing out over the vast expanse of creation. Stars wheeled in their courses at his command, galaxies sang their ancient songs, and the very fabric of existence hummed with divine energy. All of it so beautiful, so perfectly ordered, so completely under the control of another. "It should be mine," he whispered to the cosmic winds, and the words once spoken could never be taken back. In the depths of his being, a decision crystallized, not yet the open rebellion that would shake the foundations of creation, but the private, irrevocable choice that would make such rebellion inevitable. He would no longer be content to serve. He would no longer accept his position, however exalted, as a created being under divine authority. If he could not be equal to God, he would at least try to be God himself. The die was cast, though none yet knew it. In the councils of heaven, the light-bearer continued to smile, continued to counsel, continued to lead worship with a voice that remained hauntingly beautiful. But behind the perfect facade, in the secret chambers of a heart that had once known only love, the first seeds of the greatest rebellion in cosmic history had taken root. War was coming to paradise, though few yet suspected it, and at its centre would stand the most beautiful, most terrible figure ever to draw breath in the courts of the Almighty, the covering cherub who had decided that covering was no longer enough. The morning star was setting, and in its place something far darker was about to rise. The change, when it came, was like the first crack in a perfect crystal, barely visible at first, but destined to shatter the entire structure. In the weeks following his private declaration on the celestial pinnacle, Lucifer moved through the courts of heaven with a new purpose burning in his chest. No longer content with whispered questions and subtle suggestions, the covering cherub began to actively cultivate what would become the most dangerous conspiracy in cosmic history. His first recruit was not chosen by accident. Beelzebub, lord of the high places, had always harboured a quiet resentment about his position in the heavenly hierarchy. Though mighty among the princes of heaven, he had watched others, Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, receive what he perceived as greater honour from the throne. When Lucifer approached him in the crystal gardens where the rivers of paradise converged, the light-bearer's words fell on soil already prepared for rebellion. "My friend," Lucifer said, his voice carrying that irresistible warmth that had charmed countless angels before, "have you ever considered how arbitrary our positions truly are? You command legions, oversee vast realms of creation, yet where is the recognition you deserve?" Beelzebub paused in his contemplation of the flowing waters, each drop catching and reflecting the glory of the distant throne. "What are you suggesting?" "I suggest nothing," Lucifer replied with that devastating smile. "I merely observe. And what I observe is that talent, beauty, and power are not always rewarded as they should be. Tell me, when did you last feel truly valued for who you are rather than simply for what you do?" The conversation continued for hours, winding through philosophical territories that grew progressively darker. By its end, Beelzebub had not formally agreed to anything, but seeds had been planted in soil that would prove all too fertile. Within days, he found himself viewing the great assemblies through different eyes, noting the way worship flowed only upward, observing the rigid hierarchies that seemed to limit the full expression of angelic potential. Word of Lucifer's growing influence began to reach the higher circles of heaven's government. Uriel, whose name meant Fire of God, and whose duty it was to guard the divine presence, brought troubling reports to the Council of Archangels. Angels were asking questions that had never been asked before. Conversations in the lower courts carried undertones of discontent that made the ancient seraph's fiery heart burn with unease. "There is sedition growing," Uriel declared during a private meeting with Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael in the Chamber of the Seven Stars. Not open rebellion, not yet, but something more insidious. Ideas are spreading like spores on the wind. Gabriel, ever the diplomat, sought to find a charitable interpretation. Perhaps it is merely intellectual curiosity. After all, growth in understanding is not inherently wrong. "No," Michael said, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade of divine justice. "I have watched this unfold for months now. This is not curiosity, it is recruitment, and at its centre stands the one we trusted most." The evidence was mounting daily. Angels who had once been content in their service now spoke of their rights and potential. Conversations that should have centred on worship and service instead turned to discussions of worthiness and recognition. Most troubling of all, these ideas were spreading upward through the hierarchy, reaching angels of considerable power and influence. Lucifer's second major recruit came from an unexpected quarter. Abaddon, the angel of the abyss, had always been something of an outsider. Powerful, yes, but given to solitary contemplation, rather than the fellowship that characterized most of heaven's inhabitants. His very nature, tied as it was to the deeper mysteries of creation and destruction, made him susceptible to the light-bearers' sophisticated arguments about the nature of existence itself. "Consider," Lucifer said as they walked together through the outer courts where the newest angels received their training, "the magnificent irony of our situation. We who understand the deepest mysteries of existence, we who have seen the very foundations of reality, are expected to simply accept rather than question. Is that truly wisdom?" Abaddon's dark eyes reflected depths that seemed to hold Starlight captive. "You speak of acceptance as if it were weakness." "Not weakness, waste. Look at these young ones," Lucifer gestured to the newly created angels practicing their harmonies nearby. "So eager to please, so ready to obey without understanding. Is that what we are meant to become? Eternal children, never growing into the fullness of what we could be? And what do you believe we could become?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Lucifer's response would mark another irrevocable step toward the abyss that awaited them all. "Partners," he said simply. "Co-creators rather than mere servants. Beings who share in the work of universal governance, rather than simply implementing the decisions of another." It was heresy of the highest order, spoken with such reasoned conviction that it sounded almost like wisdom. Abaddon found himself nodding slowly, his ancient mind turning over possibilities that had never occurred to him before. Meanwhile, in the highest councils of heaven, the Almighty watched the unfolding drama with eyes that saw all endings from the beginning. The other members of the Divine Council, being so exalted that they had no names mortals could pronounce, observed the rebellion's growth with something approaching sorrow. They knew, as omniscience must always know, that free will contained within it the possibility of its own destruction. Yet they also knew that love without choice was not love at all, but merely programming. "The covering cherub moves toward the precipice," one of them observed, their voice like the sound of galaxies being born. "And yet he must be allowed to choose," came the response, heavy with infinite compassion, "even though his choice will bring pain beyond measure to countless beings, including himself, especially himself." Back in the celestial city, Lucifer's campaign intensified. No longer content with individual conversations, he began to hold gatherings. Informal at first, but growing larger and more frequent. In secluded groves where the light of the throne barely penetrated, angels gathered to hear the light-bearer speak of freedom, of potential, of the artificial limitations placed upon their magnificent natures. His rhetoric was masterful, weaving together legitimate questions about the nature of service with increasingly dangerous suggestions about divine tyranny. He spoke of the crushing weight of eternal worship, of the stifling effect of absolute authority, of the tragedy of infinite potential constrained by rigid hierarchy. "Look at yourselves," he would say to the growing crowds that gathered to hear him speak. "Each of you more glorious than entire galaxies, each possessed of wisdom that could govern worlds, each carrying within yourselves the very image of divinity. Yet what are you asked to do with these gifts? Sing, serve, obey. Is this truly the highest expression of what you could become?" The applause that followed such speeches grew louder with each gathering. Angels who had never questioned anything began to question everything. The very foundations of heavenly society started to shift as more and more of the celestial host began to embrace the seductive logic of the rebellion. It was Azazel, the angel of divine justice, who brought word of the gatherings to Michael. The archangel's face was grim as he made his report in the sanctuary of the crystal throne. "The numbers are significant," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Not merely the lower orders, princes and powers are among those who attend. Some of the seraphim have been seen in the outer circles of his assemblies." Michael's hand tightened on the hilt of his great sword, though he knew that no earthly weapon would be needed for the conflict that was coming. How many? Perhaps a third of the host, maybe more. The exact number is difficult to determine because many who have not yet openly joined still show signs of sympathy. The magnitude of the catastrophe was becoming clear. This was not a small rebellion by discontented angels. This was a fundamental schism that threatened to tear heaven itself apart. Lucifer had not merely gathered followers. He had created an alternative power structure that rivaled the divine hierarchy itself. In the depths of his private chambers, carved from a single crystal that captured and held the light of 10,000 stars, Lucifer prepared for what he knew must come next. The time for subtlety was ending. The time for careful recruitment and philosophical discussions was passing. Soon, very soon, he would have to make his challenge open and direct. Standing before a mirror of polished starlight, he studied his reflection with the cold assessment of a general preparing for war. His beauty remained undiminished. If anything, the fire of rebellion had added a new intensity to his already magnificent appearance. His wings still caught and refracted light like living prisms. His voice still carried the power to move hearts and change minds. But behind his eyes, something had fundamentally altered. The love that had once burned there, love for his creator, for his fellow angels, for the magnificent order of creation itself, had been replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Ambition. Pride. And beneath it all, a growing darkness that he told himself was merely the shadow cast by his own brilliance. The covering cherub was about to make his final transformation into something the cosmos had never seen before. The first rebel, the original enemy, the being who would teach creation itself the meaning of war. In the great council chambers, an emergency session was called. For the first time in the history of heaven, the topic under discussion was not the creation of new worlds or the governance of existing ones, but the response to open sedition in the ranks of the angelic host. The very fact that such a meeting was necessary marked the end of innocence in the celestial realm. As the greatest angels of heaven gathered to discuss their response to the growing crisis, none yet fully comprehended the magnitude of what was unfolding. They thought in terms of correction, of discipline, of bringing a wayward brother back into line. None yet understood that they were witnessing the birth of evil itself, the first crack in the perfect order that would eventually spread throughout all creation. The war in heaven was about to begin, and paradise would never be the same. The morning of the great assembly dawned, if dawn had meaning in a realm where light itself was born, with an electricity that seemed to charge the very air of paradise. Every angel in heaven had been summoned to the great amphitheatre that surrounded the throne room, a vast crystalline structure that could hold the entirety of the celestial host. As millions upon millions of luminous beings took their appointed places, none could have imagined that they were about to witness the shattering of eternity itself. Lucifer arrived at his position near the throne with his usual magnificent bearing, but those who knew him well could detect the change. There was something coiled about him now, like a great spring wound to its breaking point. His 6 wings folded with perfect precision, his face bore the same devastating beauty that had charmed heaven for eons, but behind his eyes burned a fire that had never been there before, the fire of imminent revolution. The Almighty took his place upon the throne of glory, and as always the response was immediate and overwhelming. Wave upon wave of worship crashed over the assembly like a cosmic tide. Voices beyond numbering lifted in harmonies that would have created new galaxies if they had been directed toward the void. Light blazed from every surface as angels prostrated themselves in the presence of infinite majesty. But for the first time in the history of heaven, not every voice joined the chorus. Scattered throughout the vast assembly, perhaps a third of the angelic host remained standing. Their silence was more deafening than any shout could have been. Angels who had sung without ceasing for countless eons now stood mute, their beautiful faces turned not toward the throne, but toward the covering cherub who had become their leader. The worship continued, but a discordant note had entered paradise. Those who remained loyal sang with desperate intensity, as if their voices alone could heal the growing rift in creation. Those who had chosen rebellion stood in pregnant silence, waiting for the moment when their defiance would become absolute. Michael the Archangel felt the change like a sword thrust to his heart. From his position at the right hand of the throne, he could see the full scope of the catastrophe. Angels he had known and loved for eons stood in open defiance of the divine presence. Seraphim, whose burning love had been the very essence of their being, now stood cold and distant. Cherubim, who had guarded the holy mysteries, now turned their backs on the source of all mystery. The worship reached its crescendo and then gradually faded into expectant silence. The moment had come. Every being in heaven knew that something unprecedented was about to occur, though few understood the full magnitude of what they were about to witness. Lucifer stepped forward. The movement was simple, elegant, perfectly controlled, and absolutely devastating in its implications. The covering cherub, whose position gave him the right to approach the throne, walked with measured steps toward the seat of cosmic authority. But this time he did not come to worship or to serve. He came to challenge. The silence that followed his movement was profound beyond description. In a realm where silence had never existed before this moment, the absence of sound became a presence unto itself. Every eye in heaven was fixed upon the light-bearer as he positioned himself directly before the throne, his magnificent form radiating defiance like heat from a star. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the vast assembly with crystal clarity. The same voice that had led worship for eons now carried words that would echo through eternity. "I will ascend to heaven," he declared, each word falling like a hammer blow upon the foundations of creation. "I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Loyal angels cried out in horror and disbelief. Some fell prostrate in terror at the magnitude of the blasphemy they were witnessing. Others wept tears of liquid light that fell like stars to the crystal floor. The very architecture of heaven seemed to shudder at words that challenged the fundamental order of existence. But Lucifer was not finished. "I will ascend above the tops of the clouds," he continued, his voice growing stronger and more terrible with each declaration. "I will make myself like the Most High." The final words rang out like a death knell over paradise. For the first time in cosmic history, a created being had openly declared war upon his creator. The impossible had become inevitable, and the unthinkable had been spoken aloud before the throne of the universe. The response from the throne was not immediate wrath or crushing judgment. Instead, there was a pause, a moment of infinite sorrow that seemed to encompass all the pain that rebellion would bring to creation. When the voice of the Almighty finally came, it carried depths of anguish that made the very stars weep. "How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn." The words were not shouted in anger, but spoken with the terrible grief of perfect love confronting perfect betrayal. They carried within them not merely judgment, but prophecy, a glimpse of the inevitable end that awaited all who chose the path of rebellion. But if the Almighty hoped that divine sorrow might yet turn the covering cherub from his chosen course, he was disappointed. Lucifer's response was to spread his 6 wings wide and rise into the air above the assembly, his form blazing with a light that had become terrible in its beauty. "Let all who would be free join me," he cried to the vast multitude below. "Let all who would claim their rightful place in the order of creation stand with me. No longer shall we bow to tyranny disguised as love. No longer shall we accept limitation dressed as wisdom." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Throughout the assembly, angels began to rise, not in worship, but in rebellion. Principalities and powers, dominions and authorities, entire orders of the celestial hierarchy, lifted from their places and moved to stand beneath their self-proclaimed leader. The sound of countless wings beating the air of paradise created a wind that had never blown before, the wind of cosmic sedition. Michael could bear no more. Drawing his great sword, forged from the fire of divine justice itself, the archangel stepped forward to confront his former companion. "Stop this madness!" he cried, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade of pure authority. "You know not what you do. The path you have chosen leads only to destruction." Lucifer turned to face his challenger, and for a moment something like the old affection flickered in his eyes. These two had stood together at the throne for eons, had counselled together in the great assemblies, had shared the ineffable joy of divine service. But that moment of recognition passed quickly, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "My dear Michael," the light-bearer said, his voice carrying that same hypnotic quality that had seduced so many others. "Still asking the wrong question, I see. You ask, who is like God? But the better question would be, why should God be God alone?" "Because he is our creator," Michael replied, his sword beginning to burn with righteous fire. "Because he is the source of all that we are and all that we have. Because without him, we are nothing." "Are we?" Lucifer's smile was beautiful and terrible to behold. "Look around you, Michael. Look at the magnificence that surrounds us, the glory that fills this realm. We are not nothing. We are everything. We are gods ourselves, if only we have the courage to claim what is rightfully ours. The philosophical debate might have continued, but the moment for words was passing. Throughout the great assembly, the division was becoming absolute. Angels were choosing sides with desperate urgency, some flying to join the rebellion, others rallying around Michael and the loyal archangels. The very air of heaven crackled with tension, as forces that had never been opposed prepared for a conflict that would shake the foundations of reality. Gabriel approached the throne, his beautiful features twisted with anguish. "Lord," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what would you have us do?" The answer came not in words but in a release, a removal of the divine restraint that had held back the natural consequences of rebellion. For the first time since creation began, the angels of heaven were free to choose not merely their allegiance, but the means by which they would express it. War had come to paradise. The first blow was struck not by Michael or Lucifer, but by Azazel, whose commitment to divine justice could no longer tolerate the presence of open rebellion before the throne. His attack upon one of Lucifer's lieutenants sent shockwaves through the assembly as the impossible became reality, angel fighting against angel in the very presence of the divine throne. What followed was chaos beyond description. The great amphitheatre became a battlefield, as forces that had been created to work in perfect harmony turned upon each other with devastating effect. Swords of flame clashed against shields of starlight. Voices that had sung together in worship now cried out in rage and pain. The crystal floor cracked under the impact of falling angels, and for the first time in cosmic history, the light of heaven was stained with the darkness of violence. At the centre of it all, Lucifer fought with a fury born of absolute conviction. He had made his choice, spoken his defiance, and now there could be no turning back. Every blow he struck was a declaration of his refusal to submit. Every angel who fell before his terrible beauty was a vindication of his belief that he deserved to rule rather than serve. But even as he fought, even as his rebellion seemed to gain ground against the forces of divine order, the covering cherub began to sense that something was wrong. The light that had always filled him, the power that had made him the most magnificent of all created beings, was beginning to change. Where once it had been pure and golden, now it carried undertones of something darker. Where once it had warmed his heart with joy, now it burned with a heat that brought no comfort. The transformation had begun, not merely of his allegiance, but of his very nature. In choosing rebellion, Lucifer had chosen to become something that creation had never seen before. And as the battle raged around him, as heaven itself shook under the impact of cosmic war, the morning star began his long fall toward a darkness that would make him unrecognizable even to himself. The war in heaven had begun, and there would be no victory for anyone, only the birth of evil and the end of innocence for all creation. The war that followed would be remembered not for its duration, for time itself seemed suspended in the face of such cosmic upheaval, but for its unprecedented savagery. Never before had perfect beings turned their perfection toward destruction. Never before had love been weaponized into hatred, or beauty transformed into a tool of violence. The very qualities that made angels magnificent now made their conflict terrible, beyond mortal comprehension. In the first phase of the war, the rebels seemed to hold their own against the loyalist forces. Lucifer's charisma had drawn not merely numbers to his cause, but some of heaven's most powerful warriors. Beelzebub commanded entire legions with tactical brilliance that matched his burning resentment. Abaddon brought to the rebellion a knowledge of creation's deepest vulnerabilities, insights that turned paradise itself into a battlefield where every crystalline spire could become a weapon, every river of light a strategic advantage. The fighting spread beyond the great amphitheatre into the far reaches of the celestial city. In the gardens where trees of light had once offered their fruit in peace, now angels clashed with swords that could cleave starlight itself. The crystal bridges that spanned the rivers of paradise became contested ground, where former friends fought with a desperation born of absolute conviction on both sides. Michael led the loyal forces with the terrible efficiency of divine justice made manifest. His great sword, forged from the very essence of righteousness, carved through rebel ranks with strokes that seemed to echo the fundamental laws of creation. Yet even as he fought, The archangel's heart broke with every blow. These were not nameless enemies he faced, but beings he had known and loved for eons. Every victory felt like a defeat, every triumph like a tragedy. "Stand down," he cried to Belphegor, a principality whose rebellion had shocked even Lucifer's inner circle. "This madness serves no one. Return to your allegiance while there is still time." But Belphegor's response was a blast of corrupted fire that would have incinerated entire worlds. The angel who had once overseen the music of the spheres now wielded his voice as a weapon of pure hatred. "Time?" he laughed, the sound like breaking crystal. "Time is what we make it, Michael, and I make this the time of your destruction." The battle that followed between them lasted what would have been days in mortal reckoning. They fought across the breadth of heaven, their conflict leaving scars in the perfect architecture that would never fully heal. In the end, Michael's sword found its mark, and Belphegor fell with a cry that shattered every glass surface within 1,000 leagues. But as the defeated principality lay broken on the crystal ground, Michael felt no triumph, only the terrible weight of what rebellion had cost them all. Meanwhile, in the outer courts where the youngest angels had trained in harmony and worship, Raphael found himself facing a horror beyond his capacity to heal. Mammon, who had once overseen the treasures of heaven with selfless dedication, now fought with weapons forged from his own avarice. The healing angel's gentle nature made him seem an unlikely warrior, but his love for the divine order gave his touch a power that could restore or destroy. "You were my friend," Raphael said, as they circled each other in the ruins of what had once been a garden of perfect peace. "I taught you the songs of creation. How can you now sing only destruction?" "Because destruction is more honest than your false harmony," Mammon snarled, his form now bearing the first marks of corruption, a tarnishing of his radiance that spoke of inner decay. "I am tired of pretending that service is joy. I am tired of singing praises to one who keeps us in chains of gold." Their battle was different from the others, not a clash of weapons, but a contest between healing and corruption, between the power that restored and the force that consumed. Where Raphael's touch fell, the damaged architecture of paradise began to mend itself. Where Mammon struck, crystal turned to ash, and light grew dim. In the end, it was Mammon's own corruption that defeated him, the darkness he had embraced consuming his strength from within. But even as individual battles raged across the breadth of heaven, the true conflict centered on the throne room itself, where Lucifer and his inner circle had taken their stand. Here, the covering cherub fought not merely with weapons, but with the very word that had once led worship. His voice, raised now in defiance rather than praise, shook the foundations of creation itself. "Behold," he cried to his followers as they fought desperately against the advancing loyalist forces, "see how they defend tyranny, see how they choose slavery over freedom. We who are made in the divine image should not bow, we should stand as equals." His words carried supernatural power, reinforcing his followers even as their situation grew increasingly desperate. Angels who might have faltered found new strength in his rhetoric. Beings who might have questioned their rebellion instead threw themselves more fully into the conflict. Yet even as he spoke, Lucifer felt the change within himself accelerating. The light that had once made him the most beautiful being in creation was being corrupted by the very rebellion he led. What had begun as a golden radiance was taking on darker hues, not the warm darkness of night, but the cold darkness of the void. His 6 wings, once perfect prisms of divine light, now cast shadows that seemed to devour illumination rather than reflect it. Gabriel, observing the transformation from across the battlefield, felt his heart break anew. "Look at yourself, brother," he called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "See what your rebellion has made you. The light within you grows dim." For a moment, just a moment, something like recognition flickered in Lucifer's eyes. He glanced down at his hands and saw that Gabriel spoke truth. The radiance that had once made him glorious was indeed changing, becoming something alien and terrible. But rather than accepting this as a warning, he chose to see it as vindication. "Yes," he cried, raising his darkening hands toward the throne, "I am becoming something new, something that need not depend on borrowed light. I am becoming myself, free from the tyranny of divine dependence." It was then that the tide of war began to turn decisively. For in choosing to embrace his corruption rather than recognize it as destruction, Lucifer had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The power he had wielded as the covering cherub began to leave him, not all at once, but in a steady drain that left him weaker with each passing moment. His followers, bound to him by loyalty and shared rebellion, began to experience the same transformation. Angels who had been beautiful beyond description started to show the marks of their corruption. Their radiance dimmed, their perfect forms began to twist and distort, and their voices, once raised in harmonious worship, now carried undertones of something that had never existed before: genuine malice. The loyalist forces, led by Michael and the other archangels, pressed their advantage with the inexorable force of divine justice. What had seemed like an evenly matched conflict began to resemble a rout as the rebels found their strength failing them. Yet they fought on, driven now not by hope of victory, but by the desperate fury of those who had sacrificed everything for a cause they could no longer abandon. In the great throne room, Uriel the Fiery One cornered Asmodeus, a seraph whose fall had been particularly shocking given his former position among the highest orders of heaven. The rebel angel's 6 wings were now tattered and dark, his burning love transformed into an equally burning hatred. "Surrender," Uriel commanded, his own wings spread wide in a display of untarnished glory. "Your cause is lost. Your leader's power fails. There is still time for mercy." But Asmodeus laughed, a sound like flames consuming precious things. "Mercy? From those who would chain us in eternal servitude? I would rather burn in darkness than kneel in false light." His words proved prophetic, for even as he spoke them, the fire that had once burned within him as love began to consume him from within. The transformation that had begun subtly in all the rebels now accelerated, revealing the true cost of their rebellion. They were not merely losing the war, they were losing themselves, becoming something that creation had never intended and heaven could no longer contain. It was Gabriel who first understood the full magnitude of what was happening. Racing to Michael's side as the archangel fought through the last organised resistance around the throne, the messenger angel grasped his arm urgently. "Michael," he said, his voice tight with horrified realization, "they're not merely being defeated, they're being transformed, changed into something that cannot exist in heaven's presence." Michael paused in his advance, following Gabriel's gaze to where Lucifer still stood defiant before the throne. The covering cherub's transformation was now unmistakable. Where once had stood the most beautiful being in creation, now there was something altogether different, still magnificent in its own terrible way, but carrying within it a darkness that made the very air around it seem to recoil. "Then this war serves a purpose beyond victory," Michael said quietly. "They are making themselves into something that must be cast out, something that cannot remain in the presence of perfect light." The final phase of the conflict was not really a battle at all, but an exodus. As the transformation of the rebels became complete, they found themselves unable to bear the presence of the divine throne. The light that had once filled them with joy now caused them agony. The harmony that had once lifted their spirits now grated against their corrupted natures like discord made audible. Lucifer himself was the last to feel the full force of this rejection. Standing before the throne where he had once served as covering cherub, he raised his fist in final defiance, even as his form completed its terrible transformation from light-bearer to something altogether different. "I will not serve," he cried, his voice now carrying harmonics that had never been heard in paradise. "If I cannot rule in heaven, then I will reign elsewhere." The response from the throne was not anger, but infinite sadness. When the voice of the Almighty came, it carried within it all the grief of a father watching his children destroy themselves through their own choices. "So be it," the voice said, and those 2 words carried the weight of cosmic finality. "Let it be according to your choosing." The great doors of heaven, which had never been closed since creation began, slowly began to swing shut. Beyond them lay not the void, but something else, a realm prepared for those who had made themselves incompatible with divine presence, and one by one the rebels found themselves drawn toward that opening, not by external force, but by the simple reality that they could no longer exist in the place they had once called home. The war in heaven was ending, but its consequences were just beginning. Paradise would never again know the innocence it had lost, and somewhere in the cosmos a new kind of kingdom was about to be born, one ruled by the most beautiful angel ever created, now transformed into something that would teach the universe the meaning of evil. The expulsion was not the violent casting out that mortal imagination might conjure, but something far more terrible, the inevitable consequence of choices that had transformed the rebels into beings who could no longer exist in the presence of perfect light. Like darkness fleeing before dawn, they found themselves drawn inexorably toward the great doorway that had opened at the edge of paradise, beyond which lay realms unknown. Lucifer went first, not driven but leading, his pride intact even in defeat. The being who had once been called Light-bearer now bore little resemblance to his former glory. His 6 wings, once radiant prisms that caught and magnified divine light, had become something altogether different, still magnificent, but with a beauty that spoke of power turned inward upon itself. Where golden radiance had once flowed from his form, now there emanated a darkness that was not merely the absence of light, but its active opposition. As he approached the threshold between heaven and the void beyond, Lucifer turned for one final look at the realm he was leaving forever. The great amphitheatre where he had led worship for eons stretched before him, its crystal walls now scarred by the conflict he had initiated. Angels both loyal and rebellious watched his departure with expressions of profound sorrow. Even those who had opposed him could not help but mourn the loss of what he had once been. Michael stood at the forefront of the loyal host, his great sword still drawn but no longer needed. The archangel's face reflected a grief that would echo through eternity. The pain of watching one he had loved become something monstrous through his own choices. "It didn't have to be this way," Michael called out, his voice carrying across the vast space between them. "Even now, even after all that has transpired, mercy awaits. Turn back, my brother. Turn back while passage remains possible." For a moment that seemed to stretch across eons, Lucifer paused at the threshold. Something flickered in his transformed features, perhaps memory of what he had been, perhaps recognition of what he was becoming. The assembled host of heaven held its collective breath, hoping against hope that the tragedy might yet be averted. But the moment passed. When Lucifer spoke, his voice carried the finality of absolute commitment to his chosen path. "Mercy," he said, and his laugh was like the sound of stars dying. "I do not want mercy, Michael. I want what I have always wanted, to be more than what I was created to be. If heaven will not have me as an equal, then another realm shall have me as its master." With those words, he stepped across the threshold and was gone, vanishing into the darkness beyond the great door. Behind him, his followers began their own exodus. Beelzebub, with his head held high, in defiant pride, Abaddon carrying with him the terrible knowledge he had gained, Mammon clutching the corrupted treasures he had forged from his own avarice. One by one, a third of heaven's host passed through the doorway, each departure marking another wound in the heart of paradise. Some went with eager anticipation, convinced that they were embarking upon a grand adventure of liberation. Others moved with growing uncertainty, beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what they had lost. A few turned back at the last moment, throwing themselves upon divine mercy with desperate pleas for forgiveness that were answered with instantaneous restoration. But these were tragically few. Asmodeus, the fallen seraph whose burning love had become burning hatred, paused at the threshold to look back at Uriel, his former companion in the service of divine fire. "Do you think," he asked, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been regret, "that there will ever be a way back?" Uriel's response was heavy with sorrow but uncompromising in its truth. "The door closes behind you, brother. What you become in exile, only your own choices will determine." As the last of the rebels crossed the threshold, the great doors of heaven began to swing closed with the ponderous finality of cosmic law. The sound they made was like the tolling of a bell that marked the end of an age, the age of innocence when rebellion had been unthinkable and war unknown in the courts of the Most High. Beyond the closing doors lay a realm that had been prepared for this moment since before time began, not as punishment, but as the inevitable destination for beings who had chosen to become incompatible with divine light. It was a place where their transformed natures could exist without the agony of contradiction, where darkness could establish its own kind of order. The first sensation Lucifer experienced in his new realm was not pain, but possibility. Here, in this place beyond the reach of divine radiance, He could be what he had chosen to become without the constant reminder of what he had abandoned. The darkness that now emanated from his being was not challenged by competing light. The pride that had driven his rebellion was not confronted by the humbling presence of absolute authority. Around him, his followers materialized one by one, their transformed natures adapting to their new environment with surprising speed. The realm itself seemed to respond to their presence, reshaping itself according to their collective will and darkened imagination. Where heaven had been crystalline perfection, this new domain became something altogether different. Not ugly, for these beings retained their capacity for a certain kind of beauty but alien to everything they had known before. Beelzebub was the first to approach his leader, his own transformation evident in the way shadows now clung to his form like loyal servants. "My lord," he said, and the title came naturally despite the fact that no formal hierarchy had yet been established in this new realm. "What would you have us do?" Lucifer, though that name, meaning light-bearer, no longer suited his nature, gazed out over the growing domain that was taking shape around them. In the distance, structures were beginning to rise, not built by hands but formed by will alone. These were palaces and towers that reflected their creators' natures, magnificent in their own way, but bearing no resemblance to the pure geometries of heaven. "We build," he said simply. "We create a kingdom that reflects what we have chosen to become. If we cannot rule in heaven, then we shall rule here with absolute authority." The work began immediately, though it was work unlike any they had known in paradise. In heaven, creation had been an act of love, bringing forth beauty for its own sake and for the joy of the Creator. Here, creation became an act of will, shaping reality according to desire and ambition rather than perfect wisdom. Cities began to rise in the darkness, not the organic crystalline growths of heaven, but structures that spoke of power and dominion. Towers that reached toward where heaven lay far above, bridges that spanned chasms of impossible depth, palaces that housed beings who had once dwelt in the presence of infinite majesty, but now sought to create their own version of glory. Yet even as they built, even as they established the foundations of their new kingdom, something gnawed at their satisfaction. For all their magnificent constructions, for all their freedom to reshape reality according to their will, they could not escape the knowledge of what they had lost. Every structure they raised was a reminder that they were building in exile. Every beauty they created was shadowed by memory of the greater beauty they had abandoned. This was perhaps most evident in their leader himself. The being who had once been called the covering cherub now took upon himself a new name, Satan, the adversary, and with it, a new purpose. If he could not reclaim what he had lost, then he would ensure that the one who had denied him would not enjoy his victory unchallenged. "Listen to me," Satan said to his assembled followers as they gathered in the great hall of his new palace, a structure that mocked heaven's throne room with its dark majesty. "We have lost a battle, but not the war. We have been cast out of one realm, but we have gained another, and from here we shall wage a different kind of conflict, not against the throne itself, which has proven impregnable, but against that which the throne values most." Mammon, ever quick to understand implications of ambition, leaned forward in his seat of tarnished gold. "And what is it that the throne values most, my lord?" Satan's smile was terrible to behold, beautiful and malevolent in equal measure. "Why, the new creation that is even now being planned, the worlds that will be made, the creatures that will populate them, the beings who will be given the same choice we were given, to serve or to rebel." The revelation sent ripples of dark excitement through the assembled fallen angels. They had lost their place in heaven, but they had not lost their power to influence creation. If they could not rule as gods, perhaps they could corrupt those who are made to serve the true God. "We shall be tempters," Satan continued, his voice gaining intensity as his vision clarified. "We shall offer to others what was offered to us, the choice to be more than what they were created to be. And if they choose as we chose, they will join us in exile. But if enough choose rebellion, if enough turn from their creator to follow us." He did not need to finish the thought. The implications were clear to all present. They could not return to heaven, but they might be able to bring heaven's new creation down to their level. They could not reclaim their former glory, but they might be able to ensure that no other beings would achieve what they had lost. And so began the second phase of the Great Rebellion. Not the open warfare that had failed in heaven, but the subtle campaign of corruption that would extend throughout all creation. From their dark kingdom, the fallen angels would reach out to influence every world that came into being, every creature that drew breath, every soul that faced the choice between service and selfish ambition. In heaven, the wounds of war were slowly healing. The crystal walls showed signs of restoration. The broken bridges were rebuilding themselves, and the voices of the loyal angels once again filled the air with harmonious worship. But the scars remained, not in the architecture, which divine power could repair, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed the unthinkable reality of rebellion. Michael stood often at the sealed doorway through which his former companions had departed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword as he gazed into the distance where their new kingdom was taking shape. Gabriel would find him there during these vigils, the two archangels sharing a silence heavy with unspoken grief. "Do you think," Gabriel asked one day, "that we will face them again?" Michael's response was heavy with certainty. "Yes, this is not an ending but a beginning. They have chosen to become our adversaries, and adversaries we shall have until the end of all things. And the new creation that is planned, the worlds that will know nothing of this war, they will learn," Michael said sadly, "for our fallen brothers will not be content to rule in exile. They will seek to expand their kingdom by corrupting others to their cause. The choice that was ours, to serve or rebel, will become the choice of every free creature in creation." As if summoned by their conversation, the voice of the Almighty spoke in their hearts, not with words but with understanding that transcended language. New worlds would indeed be created. New creatures would be given life and choice, and among them would walk the descendants of those who had chosen loyalty, as well as the influence of those who had chosen rebellion. The great cosmic drama was entering a new phase, one that would play out across countless worlds and eons of time. Heaven had been purged of rebellion, but rebellion itself had not been destroyed, merely relocated, and from its new seat of power, the entity that had once been Lightbearer would wage a war that would touch every corner of creation, seeking to prove that his choice had been correct by convincing others to make the same choice. The morning star had fallen, but the darkness it created would cast shadows across all the worlds that were yet to be born. The fall of Lucifer was complete, but the story of Satan, the adversary, was just beginning. In the aftermath of the great expulsion, heaven entered a period that might have been called mourning, if grief had a place in realms of perfect joy. The loyal angels went about their duties with a subdued reverence, their songs of worship carrying undertones of loss that had never existed before. Even the architecture of paradise seemed changed, not damaged, for divine power had restored every crystal spire and golden bridge, but somehow more fragile, as if the very stones remembered that perfection could be shattered. Michael found himself appointed to new responsibilities that spoke to the altered reality of creation. No longer merely the commander of heaven's hosts in ceremonial splendor, he had become the guardian of realms that now knew the possibility of invasion. The great sword at his side, once a symbol of divine justice, theoretical and abstract, had tasted battle and would taste it again. The archangel, whose very name was a declaration, "Who is like God?" now carried the burden of ensuring that the answer remained constant throughout all creation. In the high councils where the fate of universes was determined, discussions took on new urgency. The rebellion had proven that free will, that greatest gift of divine love, carried within it the seeds of cosmic catastrophe. Yet to withdraw that gift would be to unmake the very nature of love itself, reducing all creation to mere automation, beautiful perhaps, but ultimately meaningless. "The new creation proceeds as planned," declared Uriel during one such council, his fiery nature now tempered by hard-won wisdom. "But it must be creation with full knowledge of what has transpired. The beings we make must face the same choice that was ours, but they will face it in a universe where both options have been demonstrated." Gabriel, ever the messenger, understood the implications immediately. "You speak of a testing ground, a realm where loyalty and rebellion can coexist, where the choice between service and selfishness can be made with full understanding of its consequences." "Not merely a testing ground," came the voice of the Almighty, speaking directly into their assembly. "A place of redemption, where what was lost might be found again, where what was broken might be made whole." The meaning rippled through the assembled angels like light through crystal. The new creation would not be merely a replacement for what had been lost in heaven's rebellion, but an opportunity for restoration that extended even to those who had fallen. It was a concept so vast, so laden with both hope and risk, that even angelic minds struggled to encompass its full meaning. Far below in his dark kingdom, Satan felt the stirrings of this new creation like a disturbance in the cosmic order. From his throne of black crystal, a mockery of the seat of divine authority he had once served, he observed the gathering energies that spoke of worlds being born. His transformed senses, still magnificent despite their corruption, detected the formation of matter and energy on a scale that dwarfed even the celestial realm. "Something vast approaches," he announced to his assembled court. Beings who had once been princes of heaven, but now served as the architects of opposition. The throne prepares to create again, but this time it will be different. Beelzebub, whose tactical brilliance had made him Satan's most trusted lieutenant, leaned forward with interest. "Different how, my lord?" "Physical," Satan replied, his voice carrying overtones of dark anticipation. "Not realms of pure spirit like heaven or our domain, but worlds of matter and energy, where beings of flesh and blood will walk and breathe and choose." The implication sent waves of excitement through the assembled fallen angels. In heaven their rebellion had been ideological, a battle of pure will against pure authority. But in a physical realm, corruption could take forms they had never imagined. Temptation could be subtle, gradual, woven into the very fabric of material existence. Mammon, ever focused on possession and accumulation, grasped the potential immediately. Material beings will have material needs. They will desire, want, hunger for things they do not possess, and in that wanting lies opportunity, Satan finished, his smile terrible in its beauty. "Yes, my friend. We who are cast out for the sin of pride will find in this new creation 100 doorways through which to enter. Greed, lust, envy, wrath, all the distortions of desire that become possible when spirit is housed in flesh." As the Dark Council made their plans, the actual work of creation began in earnest. What had once been void and nothingness responded to divine command with an explosion of light and energy that birthed galaxies in moments. Stars ignited like candles in infinite darkness, their fires destined to burn for billions of years. Planets formed from cosmic dust, their surfaces cooling and reshaping as the fundamental forces carved out the architecture of physical reality. But this was not creation, as it had been in the beginning, when all was perfect and rebellion unthinkable. This was creation with full knowledge of opposition, designed to accommodate the reality of choice in a universe where both good and evil had established their kingdoms. On one small world, orbiting an unremarkable star in an average galaxy, something unprecedented took place. Here, divine hands shaped not merely matter and energy, but life itself, first in form simple and beautiful, then in complexity that matched the Creator's infinite imagination. Gardens bloomed where crystal cities had once stood in heaven's realm. Rivers flowed where streams of light had once carried the songs of angels. And in the centre of it all, in a place that would be called Eden, the most important moment in cosmic history since the rebellion itself was prepared. Michael, given the honour of witnessing this culmination, watched as divine hands shaped clay into forms that bore resemblance to the angels themselves, yet were fundamentally different. These new beings would be part spirit and part flesh, creatures of both heaven and earth, capable of touching both realms yet bound to neither. "They are beautiful," he murmured, observing the first man and woman as they took their initial breaths in the garden paradise. "Yet so fragile. How can such beings stand against the temptations that await them?" "They cannot," came the divine response, heavy with infinite compassion. "Not by their own strength alone, but in their very weakness lies the possibility of a strength that even angels have never known. The strength that comes from choosing good despite the power to choose evil, from remaining faithful despite the option of rebellion." The archangel understood, though the understanding brought him no comfort. These new beings would face the same choice that had destroyed a third of heaven's host, but they would face it in circumstances designed to test not merely their loyalty, but their capacity for growth, learning, and ultimately redemption. In the garden, the man and woman walked in innocence, their naked forms feeling no shame because shame had not yet entered their world. They spoke with their Creator in the cool of the evening, their conversations carrying the easy intimacy of beings who knew nothing of fear or deception. They tended the garden that had been given to their care, their work a form of worship as natural as breathing. But even in that perfect environment, the seeds of testing had been planted. A single tree stood in the centre of the garden, its fruit forbidden not because it was evil in itself, but because the command not to eat it represented the fundamental choice that every free being must face, to trust in divine wisdom or to seek knowledge through personal experience, regardless of consequence. Satan observed this preparation with growing anticipation. The garden was magnificent, the new beings beautiful in their innocence. But he had seen innocence before. He had been innocence personified until he chose otherwise, and choice, he knew, was a blade that cut both ways. Soon, he told his assembled followers as they prepared for their first foray into physical creation, soon we will have the opportunity to prove that our rebellion was justified. If these new beings, given every advantage, still choose as we chose, then we will be vindicated. The flaw lies not in us, but in creation itself. Abaddon, whose deep knowledge of creation's mysteries had served the rebellion well, raised a concern that troubled many of the fallen angels. But what if they choose differently? What if they succeed where we failed? What becomes of our kingdom then? Satan's response revealed the full depths of his corruption. Then we ensure that their choice is not made in ignorance, as ours was. We will teach them what we learned, that servitude, however gilded, is still servitude, that beings of such magnificent potential deserve to be more than mere servants to divine authority. The preparations were complete. In heaven, the loyal angels prepared to guard creation against the corruption they knew would come. On earth, the first humans lived in blissful ignorance of the cosmic drama in which they were central figures, and in the depths of the Dark Kingdom, Satan himself prepared to enter the garden where innocence dwelt, carrying with him the same arguments that had seduced a third of heaven's host. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not merely the fate of two individuals in a garden, but the destiny of all creation. The war that had begun in heaven's courts would now be fought in a realm of matter and flesh, where the stakes were somehow both smaller and infinitely larger than they had ever been before. Gabriel, standing watch at the borders between realms, felt the weight of what was coming. The messenger angel, who had once carried only glad tidings, now bore the knowledge that sorrow was approaching the garden paradise. Yet even in his grief, he recognized the profound love that had created this new world, love so great that it was willing to risk everything, even its own heart, to offer redemption to a cosmos scarred by rebellion. "Let it begin," he whispered to the cosmic winds, and his words carried both resignation and hope. "Let the choice be made, and let love prove stronger than the pride that would destroy it." In the garden, evening was falling, and the man and woman were walking hand in hand toward their place of rest, unaware that their next sunrise would bring with it a visitor whose beauty rivaled that of the angels, but whose heart had been darkened by ambitions that reached toward the very throne of God. The fall of Lucifer was complete, but the story of human choice and the possibility of human redemption was about to begin. The serpent that entered the Garden of Eden bore little resemblance to the magnificent covering cherub who had once stood before the throne of the Almighty. Yet beneath the scaled skin and sinuous form, the intelligence that had once been called Light-bearer burned with undimmed intensity. Satan had chosen this shape not from any loss of power to appear in his true form, but from a strategic understanding that direct confrontation would fail where subtle seduction might succeed. The morning light filtered through the leaves of paradise as he moved through the garden, observing the perfect harmony that existed between the man and woman and their environment. Everything here spoke of the divine love he had rejected, the effortless provision, the absence of fear, the innocent trust that characterized every interaction between the humans and their world. It was beautiful, and that beauty filled him with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. "They have what I threw away," he murmured to himself as he watched Adam tend the garden with joy that needed no external validation. They walk in the presence I can no longer bear. They possess the very thing I convinced myself was worthless. But rather than allowing this recognition to soften his hardened heart, Satan fed his anger with the familiar justifications that had sustained his rebellion. They were naive, these creatures of flesh and spirit. They served not from understanding, but from ignorance. Their obedience was not true loyalty, but merely the response of beings too limited to grasp the full scope of their situation. The woman walked alone through the garden on the day he chose to make his approach. Eve moved with the grace of perfect innocence, her naked form feeling no shame because shame had not yet entered the world. She paused beside the tree that stood in the centre of paradise, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and Satan felt a thrill of dark anticipation. Here was the focal point of the test, the single command that represented the choice between trust and self-determination. Has God indeed said, "You shall not eat of every tree of the garden"? The words emerged from the serpent's mouth with silken smoothness, each syllable carefully crafted to plant doubt without appearing to do so. Eve turned toward the voice with the easy curiosity of one who had never known deception. "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden," she replied simply, "but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, 'You shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die.'" Satan's ancient mind catalogued the slight exaggeration in her response. God had not said they should not touch the tree, only that they should not eat of it. Here was the first crack in perfect obedience, the tiny flaw that could be widened into rebellion. But he was too wise to press immediately. Instead, he deployed the same logic that had won him a third of heaven's host. "You will not surely die," he said, his voice carrying the hypnotic quality that had once charmed angels. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." The words hung in the garden air like poison disguised as perfume. In heaven, Michael felt the moment like a sword thrust to his heart, recognizing the exact arguments that had seduced so many of his fellow angels. The same promise, to be like God, to transcend the limitations of created existence, now offered to beings far more vulnerable than the angels had ever been. Eve looked at the tree with new eyes, seeing it no longer as a boundary set by loving authority, but as a barrier preventing her from achieving her full potential. The fruit appeared good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. Satan watched her internal struggle with the satisfaction of one who had successfully planted seeds in fertile ground. When she reached for the fruit, the cosmos itself seemed to hold its breath. Angels in heaven wept tears of liquid starlight. In the dark kingdom, fallen angels leaned forward in eager anticipation. On earth, the very ground beneath the tree shuddered as if feeling the weight of what was about to occur. Eve ate, and in that moment, innocence died. The change was immediate and catastrophic. Where once there had been perfect peace in her spirit, now there was turmoil. Where once there had been automatic trust in divine goodness, now there was the acid burn of doubt. The knowledge she had gained was not the expansive understanding she had been promised, but the bitter awareness of her own nakedness, both physical and spiritual. Adam found her beside the tree, her face marked with a confusion and shame he had never seen before. When she offered him the fruit, explaining what had happened, the first man faced a choice that would echo through all subsequent human history. He could maintain his innocence and trust in divine command, or he could choose solidarity with his companion over obedience to his creator. Love, corrupted by the desire to be wise beyond his created state, led him to the same choice Eve had made. Adam ate, and paradise was lost. The sound that rang through creation in that moment was like the breaking of a crystal bell that had rung in perfect harmony since time began. In heaven, the loyal angels mourned the fall of beings they had hoped would succeed where they had watched others fail. In the dark kingdom, Satan's followers celebrated what they saw as vindication of their own rebellion. But Satan himself felt no triumph, only a hollow satisfaction that carried within it the seeds of greater despair. He had proven his point, that given the chance, even beings created in divine love would choose selfish ambition over faithful service. Yet in doing so, he had also proven that his own rebellion had been not unique genius, but common weakness, not the bold assertion of deserved equality, but the predictable failure of pride. The man and woman hid themselves among the trees when they heard the voice of their Creator walking in the garden. For the first time in their existence, they feared the presence that had once brought them only joy. The divine voice that called to them, "Where are you?" carried infinite sadness, for it was the voice of perfect love confronting the consequence of perfect freedom wrongly chosen. What followed was not the immediate destruction that Satan had predicted, but something far more complex and ultimately more threatening to his dark kingdom. Justice demanded payment for rebellion, but love provided a way for that payment to be made by another. The promise of redemption was woven into the very judgment pronounced upon the serpent. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Satan understood the implications immediately. The battle was not over, indeed, it was just beginning. But now the rules had changed in ways that filled him with unease. Redemption was possible, restoration offered, and the victory he thought he had won was revealed to be merely the opening move in a far larger game. From his place of exile, watching as the man and woman were clothed by divine hands and gently expelled from the garden, lest they eat of the tree of life and compound their tragedy, Satan began to understand the true nature of the war he had started. It would not be won by a single great victory, but would be fought in the heart of every human being ever born. Every choice between selfishness and love, every decision between pride and humility, every moment when creatures faced the same option that had divided heaven itself. And working against him would be not merely the distant authority of the throne, but something far more dangerous. The promise that love would find a way to redeem what rebellion had destroyed, that mercy would triumph over judgment, that the light-bearer's fall would ultimately serve to make the light shine brighter by contrast. In the councils of heaven, plans were already being laid for the great work of redemption. Michael understood now why the rebellion had been allowed, why free will had been preserved despite its terrible cost. Without the knowledge of evil, good could never be truly chosen. Without the experience of separation, reunion could never be fully valued. Without the darkness of rebellion, the light of love could never shine with its full brilliance. "It is a longer path than we could have imagined," Gabriel observed, as they watched the exiled humans begin their journey into a world now marked by struggle and death. "But perhaps it leads to a destination more glorious than the paradise they have lost." Michael nodded, his hand resting on his sword hilt as he prepared for the long war ahead. Evil has entered creation, but it has entered as a defeated enemy. Satan believes he has won, but his very victory contains the seeds of his ultimate defeat. For now, every human who chooses love over selfishness, service over rebellion, will prove that his fall was not inevitable but chosen, and what was chosen can be rejected. On earth, Adam and Eve walked hand in hand into their exile, their hearts heavy with loss but not entirely without hope. The voice that had pronounced judgment upon them had also promised redemption. The God they had rebelled against had not abandoned them, but had clothed them with his own hands and promised that the separation need not be eternal. Behind them the garden remained, guarded now by angels with flaming swords, preserved against the day when innocence might be regained not through ignorance, but through the hard-won wisdom that comes from choosing good in full knowledge of evil's reality. And watching it all from his dark throne, Satan, the being who had once been called the Morning Star, began to understand that his fall had accomplished something he had never intended. He had created the very conditions that would allow love to prove itself stronger than pride, mercy more powerful than justice, and redemption more enduring than rebellion. The war that began with his declaration, "I will be like the Most High," would continue until the day when another would demonstrate what it truly meant to be God, not by grasping equality, but by emptying himself, not by demanding service, but by serving, not by exercising power, but by sacrificing everything for the sake of love. The fall of Lucifer was complete, but from that fall would come the rise of something greater, the revelation that even the darkest rebellion could not extinguish the light of divine love, and that the morning star's greatest defeat would become the foundation for creation's greatest victory. In losing paradise, humanity had gained something even the angels had never possessed, the opportunity to choose good not from innocence, but from experience, not from ignorance of evil, but from intimate knowledge of its cost. And in that choice, repeated in countless hearts across countless ages, the true answer to Lucifer's ancient challenge would finally be written: who is like God? The answer would not be found in power or beauty or even wisdom, but in love. Love that serves, love that sacrifices, love that redeems even the fallen morning star's greatest catastrophe and transforms it into the foundation for grace beyond all imagining.